recorded. So right now I'm recording it. And if you don't want to be recorded, I will, you can either just type your response and we will answer your questions. But the speakers are aware that this will be recorded, and we will load it up on YouTube right after. So if you have anybody else who can't be here but would like to hear the talk, I will give you the link. Just email me, and you can share that YouTube channel with them tomorrow or whenever I get it up. Okay. So what I'll do is, once we're going to start. Let me see. We're gonna start now. So please don't turn your camera or your mics on, because what happens is if you turn your mic on, we can hear sounds around you. And the camera, it also means that when you say something, your face will show up if you have your camera on while the other speakers are talking. Okay, so without further ado, today I'm very happy to welcome three speakers with us. That's Dr. Bridget Welch. Bridget's been very busy this year. She is also an honorary research associate with the Asia Research Institute of University of Nottingham, and Bridget and I were also organized COVID-19 conversations, and she played a big role in doing that and getting lots of interviewing very interesting people. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll be able to see some of those conversations and interviews. And then I think Bridget doesn't really require that much introduction, because she's very active in writing about Malaysian politics. Our second speaker is actually going to be Philip first, before Villashini Somaya. So Philip is a news editor for the Star Media Group, and he's got two columns writing for the Star. One is called One Man's Meat on Wednesdays, and another one's called It's Just Politics on Sundays. Okay, and our third speaker is Villa. She is a Dr. Villashini Somaya. She's a lecturer of gender studies at University of Malaya. She's also a Sabahan anthropologist. Okay, so the way what we're going to do is each speaker will speak first for about 20 minutes, and then after that we'll have the floor open for questions. And I will be trying to let people in and to look for new messages. And if you're going to ask questions at the end, like I said, you raise your hand or you type in, or by then when the speakers have stopped talking, then you can actually unmute your mic then if you would like. Okay, so Bridget will start, and what she will do is she'll lay out the context and the key issues. And then after that, we'll have Philip, and he will be talking about the parties and the coalitions, the players, where the hot seats are. And lastly, Villa will tell us about the underlying drivers of state politics, in particular the East-West divide. Okay, so without further ado, Bridget.
Hello, hi everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to speak with you about Sabah and to learn from my colleagues in the conversation. It's my first time I've shared screen on Teams, so is it looking like you can see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, fabulous. So I'm going to try to keep to the 20 minutes, and we'll just lay out a few slides in a sense to give some of the background of what's happening and what are the issues to think about as the state goes to elections, starting on Saturday, where nomination day is on, and of course on polls on the 26th of September. All right, so this is I think very important to start with from the title model that it is a local contest. And many of the issues in my field research and others, people are focused on the local issues as opposed to what's happening in Malaysia as a whole, or even in some cases what's happening in Sabah as a state as a whole. But we'll come back to the different projections and what that means in a few moments. Now, I think it's useful for us to remind ourselves what happened in GE14. GE14 was a tie. No side, Warisan Plus, the Warisan was Pakatan Harapan parties, and Barisan Nasional actually won outright. They didn't win outright in terms of the popular vote, and they didn't win outright in terms of the seats. And so you saw a government formed on that night, and then another government formed a few days later, and then, of course, attempts to topple that government in July of this year. Warisan won the predominant popular vote, particularly picking up support within the urban areas and also some of the more populated seats. But we see, in a sense, I think the perception is that this was a very similar to what happened in the peninsula, in that one party won overwhelmingly. This was not the case in Sabah. And I think one of the things that we will need to look at and keep in mind is that we have two very different political poles. Those that are attached to Barisan Nasional, now renamed in other groups and alliances, and those that are attached to the current state government led by Warisan. And we'll see how they play out and how it evolves. And of course, not to be left out of the equation is the party left by Jeffrey Kittingan, who is actually STAR, and I think is very important, particularly in places like Tambunan and others. Now, since then, we've seen some real big changes in Sabah. And of course, as I mentioned, in order for governments to form and to stay stable and others, you've seen considerable defections. Defections have taken really two forms, one centered around forming governments and making alliances to form governments, and others basically changing parties from, say, for example, UMNO to Bersatu, which has happened. And so I've just prepared a little table here, which I think is useful to kind of put it in perspective. 40% of the state assemblymen, which was at that time 60, actually jumped. We remind you, I think it's worth repeating, 40% of those, 9 of them are double jumpers. So they jump from one party to another party. And some of them were not clearly 100% sure where they've landed and if they're going to be contested again. Only one of the party slates have been partially announced. And so we do see a lot of fluidity. And this is not something new, but I just think it's useful to see how much that fluidity is a factor in Sabah compared to others. And so while there's a lot of attention to frogging in the contemporary context in terms of the government being pushed out in July, I think that there has been a tradition of jumping in Sabah that is quite practiced. And in fact, actually, there are very different assumptions about jumping. So in fact, actually, some people are actually seen to be expected of them. And in fact, they, for example, someone like Jeffrey Kittingan, who has moved to many different parties and different labels and different alliances, this kind of movement is part of his persona, and many of his supporters support him for this. While he could be, in terms of numbers and parties, clearly is the king of frogs. Well, somebody like the leader of UPCO, who moved, Marius Tangau, who moved from in 2008 to help form the Musa government, help remove the Musa government and form the Shafi government, leaving Barisan Nasional, has also been used to label this, and there were different perceptions among different supporters about frogging and the perceptions of jumping and what that means for the different base. And I think it's useful for us to contextualize this. And I think the fact of the matter is that defections are not going to be solved by the issues associated with the election campaign. I think the issues after the election, especially if the election is close, will still be a factor. And keep in mind that some of the frogging and jumping is also induced by financial positions, which also creates a factor in terms of the issues of the electorate. Many voters feel a sense of disengagement by this practice and a lot of frustration that is really legitimate. So In understanding Sabah, I think the other thing to understand is that it is very different than Semenanjung and in the peninsula and the rest of Malaysia. We see that we have 1.12 million voters, and I think that there's a tendency to, in the census material, to distinguish between Bumiputra and Muslim not Bumiputra and non-Muslim Bumiputra and Chinese and Malays and others. But in the context of Sabah, that's actually not accurate. There are different subcategories that are very important within the communities. And even, say, for example, within the Dusun, there are different types of Dusun that people connect to. And I think that ethnicity is important at the local level in terms of family connection and even in terms of voting patterns. But the framework of ethnic voting is actually quite different. Generally, there is a sense of sort of putting the KDM together, the Karazan, Dusun, and Murut, but in fact, they're actually quite different. But of course, they've seen themselves together as a part of the indigenous community. But in fact, that we see some important differences. And this makes the analysis at the local level of understanding voting somewhat complicated. And also, one has to be cautious to not overinterpret the frames and put them on the communities in the ways that they are. And keep in mind, there are also a lot of intermarriage and other that make these ethnic issues somewhat different and then in the context of Peninsula. I think the other kind of issue I want to bring attention to is that anywhere, depending on the numbers, but around a third of the electorate is disenfranchised in Sabah. That means they haven't registered. And this is disproportionately among the young. So among those between 21 and 30, 22% of young voters have not registered at all. It's not quite as high as it is in Selangor, which is around 41%. But the fact is, it's a considerable number of voters. And in fact, what we see is that younger voters under 30 should be a larger share of the electorate. They only make up 17.8% at this particular juncture. But we see that disproportionately younger voters are important, almost over 40% of the vote, but they're not as much as they should be from the perspective of disenfranchisement that exists. And part of this has to do with the fact that many people are outside of Sabah. Also, many people are also, it's difficult in some of the remote areas and rural areas where Sabah is extremely remote and rural, and many parts of its land mass don't have the same access and ease to be able to vote. And I think that it's also interesting when you look at individual seats that many of the seats have very different age compositions. So, for example, many of the KDM seats have less younger people than, for example, than we do find in many of the Malay or Baja or Suluk areas, comparatively speaking, as a point of example. The other thing to keep in mind that people don't talk enough about, which is really important to understand about Sabah, is that there are very serious economic inequalities. And I took from the more recent information from the household survey for the government that was published by the Department of Statistics last year, that came out recently, but for 2019. And so what we see is that the median income in Sabah is less than that of the peninsula by around 1,000 ringgit, more than 1,000 ringgit, so 40,235 to 5,373. And in fact, not to be left out, the bigger statistic here is that almost 20% of Sabah are considered to be poor, and this is compared to 5.6 in the percentage of the rest of the country, and this is also, frankly, a very low poverty number. So if we added in vulnerability, we would be looking at almost 40% of the population, and in a sense, one of the reasons, for example, Muhyiddin Yassin is quite popular in Sabah is because of the financial aid that he provided, or should we say the government provided, but he took credit for providing, is actually was part and parcel of something that was actually helpful for many people, and many people had not received this much money for a long time. So it was actually something that had an impact. And the issues of class are extremely important because it affects the way people engage with the system, and of course the role that money and the role of the candidates and accessibility of candidates really matter very much at the local level. So we see a very different mosaic. Sabah, by point of comparison, is
Bridget, you're frozen. Bridget?
Hello?
Yeah.
Did
okay.
I lose you?
Sorry.
Did I lose you for a second?
Yeah, you were frozen for a while.
Yeah, sorry, we have a very bad rainstorm here, and I'm not quite, I'm in, the internet is not as bad as that in Sabah, but it is difficult in sometimes, and I think in this context. Let me get back to the slides. I was saying that the other thing to keep in mind that I haven't put up here on the slides is that Sabah has the largest number of Christians in the country. So, this is something that influences a lot of seats. Okay, in terms of the seats, we have relatively less malapportionment than in many places, but there are some seats that have almost 5-to-1 ratio, Bangi compared to, say, Kapayan. The average voters in the seat is around 15,000. Many of these seats are really very, very rural. We're talking hours and hours to access, no roads, 26%, semi-rural seats. So keep in mind, 56% of the seats are considerably rural. And when I say rural, I'm talking some of the real 26% of that are very remote and difficult to access. Only 19% of the seats in Sabah, state seats, are actually urban. Generally, the 13 new seats, which I've written about yesterday in Malaysia Kini, they tend to favor BN somewhat in individuals, but generally most of them still remain competitive. The most important thing from this particular slide is that based on my analysis of looking at the local level, we're still waiting for the candidates to come in, but through interviews and others, my assessment at this potential juncture is that 50 out of the 73 seats are extremely competitive. That means 68.4% of the seats are competitive. This means that they can be won by different candidates from both sides, depending on how the campaign evolves. This is my point of saying is that the campaign will matter in the contest as things move forward. So just to take a little look back at voting patterns, I've put up here some of the information by ethnicity using polling station data to see how the vote that was there. I think there are just a couple things I want to pull out of this because I realize I'm going a little over time, and that is the issue of that KDM support stayed with Barisan Nasional and in fact moved back to Barisan Nasional, and I think the KDM support among the Kedasan Dusun and Murut community will be very important in how it affects the outcome for this particular election. We can see also that there were significant swings among the Bajau, which of course were very important for Warisan, and of course we can see support that continues to swing in different directions for different communities. In the context of the Malay support went for Barisan, others that such as communities like Orang Sungai and others went for Warisan. So we're going to see different ethnic configurations. But as I pointed out earlier, in understanding Sabah voting, you have to look at class, generation factors. Younger voters voted for Warisan disproportionately, and gender. Women disproportionately vote for Barisan Nasional in whatever form that it has, across ethnicities, in fact. But keeping in mind when we understand Sabah politics is that there is a significant what I call Sabah swing. So we can see that in the voting patterns from 2008 all the way to the contemporary voting patterns, even through Kamani's by-election in January of this year, there can be up among certain communities and others up to a 30% vote swing. And that is something to keep in mind, which contributes to the competitiveness of the contest. I think in particular, as an analyst looking at voting behavior, I'm looking to see how consistent Barisan support levels are, especially on the East Coast, and what's happening in the KDM seats, which I think are going to be very important in affecting the overall outcome. Just a couple other slides that I put on here for thinking about this. The other thing to keep in mind is that money is very important in Sabah elections. And of course, there's a tendency to sort of discount voters as being influenced by voting, by vote buying and others. And I would suggest that this is a very strategic aspect of the way people engage their system. They're not getting much anyway. They might as well get something for the day and they also vote in different particular sets of ways. I've assessed the seats in terms of the scope of how much voting, how much money is a factor in terms of shaping outcomes. And what we're looking at is almost 60% of the seats in Sabah can have an important financial influence in terms of affecting the election. Seats like Kuamut, seats like Nabawan, seats like Lamak. These are areas where financial resources make a big impact. Even in places closer to KK, such as Limbahau, have an influence in terms of money. Some of them are in the more moderate range. And what we're talking about, when you speak to individuals in the financial side, limited amount, 150,000. Sometimes it goes up to as much as 6 million that was spent in one of these state seats. So we're looking at an average around 1 million. Again, depends on who you speak to, but what we're saying is that money will matter in this contest. It matters more in contests where this has been a dominant practice, and it matters less in places where people try to use issues and the more urban seats, and also parties that don't have the same resources. Now, I'm coming to the end of my time, and there's still a lot to talk about. And I want to leave my colleagues enough time to raise issues, but I want to talk a little bit about what the focus groups and others are talking about are the issues in the campaign. State autonomy in the MA63 agreement still ranks very high among Sabahans across communities. Leadership, who's going to be the next CM or continue with the same CM? I think the Warisan is pushing for a more presidential type of election versus the leadership issues at the local level. Many people speak about their candidate representation, accessibility, development, access, and improving the community, and of course also frogging. Economy, land, livelihoods, issues of poverty and vulnerability are very high on the average voter's person's perspective, coupled with issues of infrastructure, aka also internet, services, governance, and of course the very sensitive but very problematic issue of PTI of illegal immigrants in Sabah, which is a persistent problem. I've spoken too long, but I will now turn it over to my colleagues to begin the conversation and continue the conversation. Thanks so much, Gay.
Thanks, Bridget, for that really, big oversight, laying out the context for us. Looks like there are lots of issues to think about. Philip, can I get you to go next? And you have to unmute. Great, thank you.
Yeah, okay. I can start now.
Yeah, but Bridget, you have to unshare.
Hello.
The floor is yours, Philip.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for joining our talk on Sabah election. I'm a Sabahan, and it's an exciting time for me. Okay, the first question I was asked is, who's against who in this election? And then the problem is, the friends are enemy and enemies are friends in this election. I just give you an example. Technically, there are two teams that are against each other. One is the Warisan Plus, which is led by Warisan, and then DAP, PKR, and UPCO. And then the other team will be Barisan Nasional, Perikatan Nasional, and then PBS. Okay. However, just say we go for today's big announcement on candidates. Warisan Plus announced the candidate. However, PKR was missing. So why are they missing? And then is it that PKR has gone rogue and therefore it might contest against its Warisan partner? So from kawan, it can become lawan, or from friends, it can be enemy. So there's a big question on what's next for PKR, which is led by Anwar Ibrahim. And we don't know because PKR hasn't announced yet. So probably they might go rogue or they might stay loyal to Warisan Plus. Okay, that is the government side, the state government side. Okay, how about the opposition? The main opposition is Perikatan Nasional, Barisan Nasional, and PBS, which is the government in the federal level. And then this one is already very clear. For example, Bung Mokhtar announced his UMNO candidates and the seats that they are contesting. And then he has named, for example, Paginatan and Telupit, which PBS is eyeing. And then it's already the word that that PBS uses, they're going to langgar. Langgar means they're going to have a collision or a clash with UMNO in that seat. So a big question now is, will PBS give way to UMNO in their traditional seats, or will they fight? So it's very likely it will be a fight. So in terms of UMNO and PBS, there will be overlap of seats that they are going for. And then the other one will be STAR. STAR at the moment has announced that they're going for 8 seats. And then when I look at that 8 seats, they've announced, for example, Moyog and also Paginatan also. So it looks like they're going to clash with PBS. And then Bersatu, I think they have not announced yet. So I think Bersatu has the least enemies in this coalition. So big problem for this, the main opposition coalition is infighting in maybe 6, 7, or 8 or 9 seats. It depends on the game. So that's number one. Then number two, I think the big story will be UMNO definitely Musa is not contesting under UMNO. So the big question is, he has indicated based on his FB posting yesterday that he's going home, which is Sungai Manila, which is technically his seat. So if he's going home, but in which vehicle is he going home to? UMNO is not in the UMNO vehicle because UMNO has said no to him. So is it Bersatu? But it's unlikely Bersatu because Bersatu did not get that quota for Sungai Manila. So if he really need a vehicle, it can either be PCS, which is Parti Cinta Sabah, which is a party led by his brother, or he can also go using Star, which I think with Dr. Jeffrey, he can be predictable in an unpredictable way. So maybe he might accept him in the last minute, or maybe Musa will go with PBS. But at the moment, I think things are still very fluid, and then we still got a lot of time. Saturday is another, I think, less than 48 hours, but there's still time. So things can happen. And then if things happen with Musa, then we might be seeing a third alliance, which is, it might be local-based parties, which is maybe Star and then PCS combining together with PBS against the two other coalition that I mentioned. Okay, now we go to personality. I think Sabah has this larger than life kind of personality, and they dominate the political theater in Sabah. So I wrote a column today. My column, I wrote it in this column called Politics in 500 Words. So I had a very short introduction of the 7 characters who will play maybe a big role in this election. So I started with number 1 is Shafi Abdal. Shafi Abdal definitely will be the big player because one thing about him is his advantage is most of his coalition partner have agreed that he is the chief minister candidate. So therefore, there's no confusion who will be the chief minister for Warisan Plus, except if PKR decide otherwise. Okay, and then when you go to the BN, PN, TBS coalition, I don't think they will name any CM candidate for this election. It's because most probably what they will do is, first of all, they will not name, because what they will do on that night of the election, they will see on which party first get the most votes, well, no, get the most seats, or which party or which individual or which politician can cobble up the most assemblymen. So there might be some jumping on that night. So roughly, maybe that's how the opposition main alliance will decide on the election. So I just give you an example. Example is, just say Bung of UMNO, just say UMNO win the most seats. So I think Bung will lay claim that he should be the Sabah Chief Minister. However, if just say Hajiji managed to get less seats, but maybe he managed to get more assemblymen, maybe from Star or even PBS, then he also can lay claim. So for the opposition, it's very messy actually. Okay, so but for Shafi, I think he's quite steady. Okay, then the next big character in this election, which I see actually is Musa Aman. And then this election, it looks like it's a grudge match between Musa Aman and Shafi Abdal. Musa, I think, is a big player is because he has vast resources and also he has the political acumen. The very fact that he can get 32 assemblymen, including himself, to declare that they support him and therefore causing the collapse of the Warisan Plus government, it tells a lot actually. It tells that he is a force to be reckoned. So for me, Musa is the second big player in it. Then third will be people like Bung Mokhtar, who consider himself as the Duterte of Sabah. He is, if he becomes the chief minister, he'll be the no protocol kind of chief minister. He'll be like Duterte, Sabah's Duterte. Then the other player will be Hajiji, because it's likely also, if just say the main opposition win, Hajiji, who is Mr. Nice Guy, can be the CM. Okay, so that's 4 people. Then the maverick out of all this in this is, I think it's Dr. Jeffrey, but I think his chances of becoming CM has gone less actually, because he has changed his mind actually. He was supposed to maybe have a agreement with PBS to use the PBS logo, and therefore they can go and maybe contest in 24 seats and hopefully win maybe 20 seats, and therefore he's in the running to be a chief minister like his brother Pyrin. However, it looks like Jeffrey is only going for maybe 8 seats, therefore his chances of becoming CM is less. Okay, then the other player will be Anifa Aman. Anifa will be very interesting. I think Anifa is with Parti Cinta Sabah, which Sabah Love Party. And then I think he's only eyeing for maybe 2 or 3 seats. But in the event that there's a hung assembly, which happened in the year 2004, happened in the year 2018, then Anifa can play a big role. And I think Anifa's platform is he's using his experience as a foreign minister to say that he's the man who can deal with international issues that Sabah is facing, for example, like the South China Sea and then the Philippines' claim to Sabah. Okay, then the last person will be Chong Kaket. Chong Kaket is quite an interesting person. It's like there are substantial Sabahans who thought that in his 2 years as a rotated chief minister that he was the guy who cleaned up the Sabah's illegal immigrant problem. However, was some journalists who were covering him back then. I think it's all about perception. People think that he managed to clean up, but the big question is, if he really cleaned it up, then why are the illegal immigrants still in Sabah? So, but whatever it is, public perception is that he did something. Hold on, I lost my earphone. Okay, never mind. I can't find it. So okay, hold on. So roughly those are the personalities. And then okay, in terms of seat, for me is the interesting seat is the 3 seats in Sepangar. For me, it's a barometer. First of all, Sepangar is a parliamentary constituency next to Kota Kinabalu. It's only maybe 10-15 minutes away from Kota Kinabalu. And then for me, it's a barometer. If just say there's 3 seats there, just say Ilanam, and then Darau, and then Karambunai. PKR has won that seat in Anam. If Warisan Plus loses it, it's an indication that they've lost support among the Kadazan and Chinese, which are the main ethnic group in that seat. And then the other one is also Karambunai. If Warisan does badly there, meaning they have lost support of the mostly Bajau Suluk voters. And the seat Sepangar is actually won by Warisan, and they've won all 2 of the seats there in G14. So that seat I'll be watching actually. Okay, roughly that's my explanation on Sabah. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip.
Okay, I go and look for my headset first.
Okay, can you turn off your mic and your
Yes.
Okay. So Villa's up next. Villa, you have PowerPoints?
Yes, I do. Hold on. Can everybody see my? Oops, sorry.
Yes.
Can ya?
Yep.
All right. Ready to go?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Like Bridget, I'm in rainy, sleepy Kuala Lumpur, soon to be returning to the motherland, KK. And I'm really happy to be able to speak alongside two fantastic political analysts, a political scholar. My presentation today is a little bit more abstract in the sense that I'm not pulling numbers, not really, and I'm not showing you really breakdowns of things because that's not my training. I'm an anthropologist, but it's to really sort of give you an idea about what are the sort of major issues that are at play when we do think about Sabah politics in general. And while there may be many other factors that can influence Sabah politics in general, which my colleagues have so wonderfully described, the main issue that I want to bring here is that there is a currency in trying to understand the East Coast in the greater Sabah politics. So, to quote Boys to Men, I am doing a little East Coast swing. So let's see. Right. This is a supposed alleged image or multiple images of the Home Minister Hamzah Zainuddin that went viral on the 30th of July, the same day that Chief Minister of Sabah, Shafie Apdal, announced the snap elections. And the depiction of these images is that Hamzah Zainuddin is returning, in great sadness and disappointment to Kuala Lumpur after failing to convince the governor of Sabah against having a snap elections. And these images are incredibly powerful simply because of this larger idea of the warrior protecting, warriors with warlords protecting Sabah. One of the captions that came out here very interestingly said, "Sini dia Hamzah Zainuddin, here is Hamzah Zainuddin, Menteri Pintu Belakang PN, kecewa berambus balik ke KL setelah gagal merampas kerajaan Sabah." Here is the backdoor leader Hamzah Zainuddin, in great disappointment, leaving back for Kuala Lumpur after failing to capture Sabah again. TYT Sabah Johar, CM Sabah, Shafie Apdal, dan orang Sabah bukan calang-calang tau. Jangan ingat datang sembarangan saja boleh membuli kita. Don't think you can come here and bully us. And I kind of randomly picked out two comments from this particular thread. One of them said, "Ya, jangan kau sama bangsa kami. Don't play with our race." Followed by a reply that said, "Pantai Timur ba? The East Coast." So why is the East Coast essentially a narrative when it comes to Sabah politics? Why and why is this important? Whoops, give me a second here, guys. I've lost you. There we go. All right. And why is it a very important narrative? Because the narrative of the East Coast is built around this idea of treachery. This is the treacherous East Coast. And it is a very, very important currency in the larger scheme of the political tribalism of Sabah. And why I refer to this idea of tribalism essentially is that there is this ethnic, religious, class, spatial loyalty and identity that are formed around these sort of political narratives about the East Coast. So let's move on. All right. So in order for us to really understand this, and I hope all of you can see this, it may be a little bit blur, but I will do my best to explain this, is that one way of really unpacking this idea of treachery of the East Coast lies in several major turbulent events that have happened. So this is a brief history of turbulences, socio-political turbulences that have happened in Sabah. If you follow in the top line with the orange line, we're looking at these sort of external factors. And everything that has been major by way of external has come from, unfortunately, our neighbors in the Philippines. It really starts with the Philippines making a formal claim for North Borneo, and really sort of taking it to another level. And of course, other non-state actors have participated in this by way of, Abu Sayyaf kidnappings, and others so on claims. Very, very famous one, of course, in 2013, when there was the Lahadatu standoff, as the army of parts of Mindanao essentially came in and said, we're staking a claim on Sabah. So you have that on the external level. But internally, this in effect also influences a lot of things that are happening inside of Sabah. In the very beginning in 1963, when Sabah finally sort of solidifies the joining of Greater Malaya to form Malaysia, and this too has become an issue. Bridget has pointed this out in reference to MA 63. We won't get into that, but of course, there's, I'm trying to make room for discussion later. Is that it really starts off in itself with a feud, right? We see now here the feud between Tun Mustafa and Tun Fuad Stevens, two leaders really trying to fighting for control over the Greater Sabah, trying to lead it into progress and development simply because of their ethnic descent. Tun Mustafa was a person of Bajau Suluk descent, and Tun Fuad of Kadazan British descent. And this goes on for a long time. We then see the rise and fall of the Berjaya administration between 76 and 85. And in the 90s, where federal powers sort of come into play into Sabah through the solidification of UMNO and the very famous rumored start of Project IC, led by, or allegedly being led by Tun Mahathir. This, of course, utilized a lot of a demographic of people from the east coast of Sabah, the influx of irregular migrants there to participate in this. And by 1994, UMNO takes over Sabah. We see the 2-year rotation of the chief minister. And, 2018, Warisan comes into play. Bridget made a very good point to highlight that they didn't win by a landslide. And today in 2020, what do we have externally and internally? Philippines now resurrects these claims over Sabah. And internally, we have this massive political crisis that's happening throughout the country. And then there's the Sabah snap polls. So when we sort of look at this, I'm trying to unpack here what it is that the East Coast is essentially accused of. First and foremost, you take a look at Project IC, this idea of phantom voters really coming in, giving a hard time to to Sabahans who already don't have enough of a say against the federal government. The danger of the big bad blue sea, right? The porous geography and untamed sea, a mysterious ocean that, it's very difficult to understand. This concept of stranger danger. This is the root, or this is the site of the influx of irregular migrants. Different opposing religious positions, this issue of Christianity versus Islam. It is believed that majority of the people who occupy the East Coast practice the Islamic faith. It's also then an issue of loyalty. Can East Coasters be trusted for the greater good of Sabah? And lastly, the last most important conversation to talk about, who is indigenous here? Are all coastal people indigenous? Because if they are, they do have these greater links to the Philippines. What about us here in the inland? So all this sort of coming together formulates this idea of the East Coast treachery in the political narrative of Sabah. So, I think adding to that is when a state is already so poor, and they're deprived of even more because of it. Warisan comes into the picture for the 14th general elections, and unpacking their presence and their representation is also very important. When Warisan came into the scene, a lot of people who, of course, have a great concern over new players coming from the East Coast, is that it was perceived to be East Coast rooted. In conversation with several key informants within the Warisan Party, this particular logo, which is why I put here, depicts for them this idea, this notion of new unity between East and West and the multiple different ethnic groups that are at play in Sabah. But for many others, there is a general hesitancy when you do see a logo of this sort. Please excuse me. In which it is an idea that the image of the boat is significant or symbolizes that, it's the coming of the outsider. Again, stranger danger coming into play. So Bridget highlighted this and Philip highlighted this, that Warisan did not initially win the elections in the traditional sense. They didn't win by a landslide. It really was actually a tie. But through frogging and negotiation, it gave them a simple majority. For those who didn't believe in this sort of, presence of the dangerous East Coast, it didn't make Warisan's, entrance into Sabah Putrajaya easy. It wasn't an easy 2 years. First of all, there was the constitutional crisis. It's still ongoing, or it's just ended with the two chief ministers. And then there's this continuous frogging between Warisan and BN and other groups as well. And ultimately, it is a show that everybody is a politician, but nobody is actually really a statesman. So what does Warisan do at this particular point? Headed by Shafi Abdal, of course, who, as I mentioned earlier, is of Bajau Suluk descent, a member of the East Coast. He now tries to make this show of benevolence, kindness, love, unity, trying to really push this idea of a united administration. We work with all, we want autonomy, we are the people who will protect and safeguard Sabahans, Sabah for Sabahans. This image essentially shows Shafi in an opening ceremony for a church event, which I think, to some people, it is incredibly important, because if you can sort of celebrate, I think, a Christian heritage in Sabah, then essentially it means that there is a sort of a possibility for moderate approaches to politics. But in actually bridging the gap, I think there's one thing that we really have to pay attention to. I quote here a report produced by SEEDS, the Society for Empowerment and the Economic Development of Sabah, that they recently released, that almost 45% of all voters are under the age 40. They are millennials. They were born in 1980. They were the first to be introduced to the internet, so on and so forth. And that their position was that SEEDS essentially made the claim that the Sabah electorate is getting increasingly young, and that they are the most aggressive, unpredictable demographic, and persuading them requires a lot of pragmatism, patience, and innovative dialogue. And there might be some truth there. Because essentially, I personally believe that youth participation is incredibly key in really unpacking, changing the way this works. The East versus West narrative has solidified with older Sabahans, and you can't really blame them, because that's been the game from day one. But both sides of the coast essentially are quite actively engaged through a much younger demographic, because there is this very strong sense of fatigue and disappointment with an unstable and inconsistent local political landscape. And also this recognition that there is a youth vacuum in leadership roles. Philip really interestingly pointed out, and in his article today, looked at all the key players. And in many of the youth groups that I communicate with, it's always about why are they of a particular race and a particular gender. And this also becomes very problematic for many young people who are now speaking to each other across the coast. So we now see this new movement of a new generation of young people really joining alternative movements. An example of this would be the Pulang Mengundi Sabah movement that is trying to gain some traction. What is key here in this argument that I'm trying to make? Well, at least for a lot of young people, the term kita or kekitaan has essentially come to the fore again. It made a presence in GE14, but I think at this point it's being pushed a lot harder, especially with a lot of rural youth. Kekitaan, for those of my friends here who may not understand, essentially translate to us, or a sense of us-ness, or really camaraderie. I want to use the example of a really hot topic today. YouTube blogger Viviana Mosibin, And for those of you who don't know, she was, unfairly accused by members of the government for lying in her YouTube blogs about, climbing up a tree and finishing an examination. And later it was found out that she never lied. She told the absolute truth, and she was, really heartbroken. And what's very interesting is what's happening here is a lot of young people are now recognizing that the issue has never really been about race or this sort of spatial differences, but it's placed in the issue of class and income level. For many young, poor Sabahans, which are quite a number, they experience this lack of basic amenities to thrive, to do something with their lives. And essentially, it's an issue of being bullied bullied into believing that their words, their points of views, their emotions do not matter. And this is regardless of which side of the coast you come from. So the big question is the East Coast still a factor? Is East Coast treachery still a factor in the state elections of 2020? On one hand, yes, of course it is. It still has political tractions, especially for certain groups that are a little older, groups that, that I guess have a very strong sense of loyalty towards political ideologies that they've been following for many years. It's a very prevalent narrative, especially amongst the poverty-stricken, and in consideration of a lot of very great difficulty about the lives that they lead. But at the same time, it's no, because we do see these generational shifts. And while a lot of people may not want to necessarily pay attention to this, I think it's incredibly important, because you now have an entire generation that communicates so differently from the other generations prior to them. They speak in emojis and short forms and through social media. And while social media does offer both noise and facts on the same platforms, they are these sort of realities that we are able to unpack about what it means to be Sabahan. I'm missing, there's something wrong with my slides here, but it's an issue that an emergent coastal East Coast presence in the West isn't something new. It isn't something that has affected for better or for worse. If the fear has been that it is a takeover, that takeover didn't necessarily change anything. So it's back to the drawing board in unpacking what's real and what's not, and what can be useful in the later parts of politics. So what's necessary, and I kind of want to end it with this, is that there is a great need for a change of state narrative in sort of solving the East Coast conundrum, because I think it impacts everything in general. It makes the politics very dated. On one hand, there are these issues in Sabah that needs to be, they tend to be analyzed in silo, but in actuality, they are part of a very broad spectrum of complex issues. And I think analysts and scholars need to recognize this, that it's not an issue that the Dusuns or the Rungus or the Orang Sungai or the Kadasans suffer from in silo, but they are essentially, they are a network of issues that are interconnected. There is this call for a more unified and updated Sabah identities. I said that, right? It's not identity, it's identities. And it's very difficult to have a singular identity, simply because Sabah is an incredibly large territory with so many different tribes and so many different groups and so many different ethnicities and representation. The ethnicities need to come into it. So, this is important so that people don't become victim to the kind of division, and in recognizing that race and class and the urban-rural divide have very different effects on all. And lastly, it is an issue of an immediate focus on empowerment programs, simply because the youth and young people from both the East and the West Coast are suffering from issues pertaining to jobs and education and a sense of leadership. And if that isn't dealt with immediately, then Sabah is not going to be able to progress and develop and thrive. So I end it here today. And as we do say in Sabah, bah, terima kasih ya. So I hand it back to you, Gek. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Villa. We've heard from 3 people talking about Sabah, and if anything, if there's something in common there, it's about how complicated and how, in a way, you can't just consider one aspect of identity, but that it overlaps. So you have to consider not just ethnicity or religion, but also age and gender, and whether they're rural or urban, and whether they're East Coast or West Coast. So just to get the ball rolling, if you want to ask questions, you can unmute and ask, or you can raise your hand and do that. Okay, Nadira?
Hi everyone, thank you. That was so informative. I guess this question, I think Vila would know how to answer this, but I'd really like to hear from the rest as well. So when it comes to elections, right, the issue that I always struggle with as a filmmaker, well, just in general, is the communication. How do we have voters who are informed if we don't have the media? So I'm back in Sabah now, and speaking to some of my informed peers as well. They are now talking about forming a Sabah TV, the way that Sarawak has a Sarawak TV, and that's made possible because the last administration has gone from analog to digital. Their feeling is that because in KL, they're not making spots for Borneo-made content. There's no room for our narratives. So do you think this would make a difference, and do you think this is necessary, or what is needed? What other networks are there provided besides social media to keep voters informed?
Thanks, Nadira. Can I have a stab at it, guys?
Yes.
Bridget, Philip, yeah, I'll let you go. Thanks, Nadira. It's so good to hear from you. I think you've raised an incredibly important question, and you know as well as I that not everybody's going to have access to data. Not everybody's going to be on Facebook. Not everybody is going to have Twitter. And even if they do, they kind of speak different languages. They translate very differently, and they have different usages and values. And I recognize that the issue with Sabah essentially is that they continue to be measured by the same standards that I think the Peninsula sets for us, especially when it comes to young people, simply because there's an understanding that you have access to basic internet and basic digital technology, and therefore you should be able to do the same things that we do. And this is incredibly not true. More often than not, something gains traction on WhatsApp rather than Facebook or a tweet, right? And I think the issue here is that we need to really obviously the most obvious answer is in ensuring that the manifestos that a lot of these politicians are going to sort of bring up. Now, of course, I'm not saying trust the manifestos, but I'm saying that they need to recognize that this is a shortcoming for young people, because you are only as good as your weakest link, and trying to find ways of really pushing for access, of digital access. But I think the other issue is that is going to take time. That's not going to be a practical thing to see happen and change in the next 1 year. Simply because, it's an issue of resources, money, time, energy, people to actually come forth and do it. And there's a politics in that as well. What we also need to do is we need to find out different ways that different platforms need to come forth and assist young people, especially in non-urban spaces, in the periphery, in seeing how they can be helped, right? A lot of discussion about indigenous knowledges that young people do pick up, for example, ways that content and information can be packaged differently and made accessible really fast throughout the state has to be considered. And, of course, I'm very interested in also hearing how you and your efforts and the work that you've done can really help with this as well.
Okay, great.
Can I chime in a bit just to add on a little bit? Maybe Phil, do you want to go ahead?
You go ahead first. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, as the non-Sabahan speaking, the social media space, as you well know, in Sabah is very different. So it's on Facebook, and the thing that I found when in talking to local and my local focus groups and others throughout the state is WhatsApp is extremely important. Even though there are access problems, particularly in the remote area, there are still local WhatsApp groups more comparatively. And so in the context of communication, social, local trusted networks in the society are extremely important. That's why you see church groups, religious communities, as actually shaping conversations. And so the conversations are very localized in the way that they are communicated, not through, and I think the sense is, in particular, you know, when you're in KK, KK is almost very much like peninsula in the sense that it is so connected. But when the further you get out from the capital, the more remote, the more these local networks become very important, and the trusted small communities that they have. So in a sense of looking at issues of communication, it's about trying to expand your networks through these WhatsApp communities and trying to localize the conversations through these particular areas. It's very challenging, because it's still very much old politics and old community politics in the way people interact in terms of, because of the lack of internet capacity.
Okay. Hello.
Philip?
Okay. Hi Nadira, how are you? Okay. I just
I'm
want to
good.
expand
Yeah.
on okay. I just want to expand on what Bridget said. I have the same idea as hers. But for me is, what you need is you're going to have a Sabah TV, isn't it? So first of all, it's a short while, but you need to create credibility, that people know that it's a brand, that Sabah TV is credible. It's not telling fake news, or you're not siding with party A, B, C, D. Okay, that's number one. Number two, I agree with Bridget. Facebook is king, but WhatsApp is a bigger king. Okay, so what you need to do is, maybe you need those short, viral kind of video or infographic that people can share and it goes viral. So just say you need to explain maybe internet or certain topics. So you do it maybe in that Al Jazeera style of infographic, very short, and then you don't need even spoken language. You can, when people look at it, they just understand what you're telling. Or you can even have just say you talking and explaining issues, but you need to be balanced. Once you have that and then it goes viral, then technically that's how I'll do it now. Thanks.
Okay, great. I see a few questions in the chat box, so I'm just going to read them out and see if we get any of the speakers to answer them. First question is, assuming Haris Saleh makes a comeback, would he have significant clout? Anybody? Just a short one, because we've got three other questions.
I think him contesting as a CM, I mean as a candidate, no, because people have forgotten about him. I think it was what Berjaya lost in 1985, but his money will be helpful. So in terms of influence, his money, but not his candidacy. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. You brought up again an item that Bridget also talked about. A question, as someone who's unfamiliar with the topics that Villa mentioned regarding East Coast treachery, are there any specific topics or readings you can recommend, or allow us to explore more context on the topic? And maybe, Villa, you can also type it in.
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. I just wanted to make a very quick, before typing it in, is that I think when we do say recommended readings, it could be for popular consumption or academic consumption. I think probably writing a lot about it, our very own Philip here has written a lot about Sabah. So, you know, I'll hand this back to him a little later. But I also want to say that by way of more scholarly written work about Sabah, there's always been, you know, great lacking in that sense, simply because I think there was a lot of involvement from, the greater administration in previous years to really control the kind of academic work that's produced about Sabah generally, especially in the East Coast, because they were host to so many irregular migrants. But there might be one or two that I could suggest, and I'll do that a little later. Thank you.
Great.
Can I answer?
Yeah.
Okay, for me to answer that question is, my advice is the person has to go to Kota Kinabalu, understand the West Coast people, and then also go to East Coast, let's say for example, Semporna or Lahada too. And then what you do is you talk to locals and then you'll understand. I think it's better than reading a book. Thanks.
Okay. Fazila, you'll have to unmute, but let me quickly take the questions that were asked first, if you can hold your thought.
Yeah.
Okay. Question from Yap Huang, I think. What's made PAS decide to contest seats in Sabah? Is Islamist politics gathering steam in Sabah, or is this nothing new?
I'll answer the question. I don't think PAS is contesting in Sabah. I think. Thanks.
Okay. So
I'll add a little bit. I think
okay,
that
great.
whether or not in 2013, PAS did not lose their deposit as part of a larger Pakistan Rakyat situation. And so they have this kind of vision that they actually have much stronger support. In 2018, they lost their deposit in all their seats. I think there are some pockets of conservative religious communities in some places such as Tawau and Pututan and around the KK area. But I think that whether or not they have a viability to contest really will depend if they get a seat. And I think it looks like they will not at this juncture within the context of the coalitions. If they do get a seat, then they may have it. I think they still have very serious problems of being able to win over even within the Muslim community, comparatively speaking. So I think that, and also PAS is a liability, especially in the KDM Christian communities, and that it's a liability for anyone who brings it into the alliance. Not to the same way it is in Peninsula Malaysia, but it is a liability because PAS his comments have really been offensive to many Christians, and this has been raised by Sabahans. So I think it'll be very interesting to see if they do end up contesting. But I think Phil is probably going to be right on this.
Okay. Moving along really quickly. I'll just take one question from the chat box before we come to you, Fatzila.
Yeah.
This is a question about gender. Can you elaborate on how gender as a category analyzes the voters' political position and their electoral choices? Bridget, you mentioned earlier that women tend to vote for BN. Bridget?
Why don't we have Villa start with this and then I'll follow up.
Gee, thanks, Bridget.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, back in 2018, I went around Sabah during the campaign period with Dr. Mazna Muhammad, who's here with us today, speaking to female, candidates about it. And some of the major takeaways is that, how gender essentially impacts, I think, first of all, the candidates when they do come into play is that there is this fear that they are placed in places that the party doesn't see a potential win. So women are essentially there to, sort of like fill in a gap where, men who can potentially win would essentially head to. That's one of the conversations we've had. Number two is the other issue that I've learned, at least, and not all women will vote for women, and that's hardly ever the case. In fact, women would prefer to vote for men. In some of the places, or at least some of the constituencies that I followed in the previous elections, this is essentially true. We had the same issue in Kulu and things like that, simply because it's a sort of sense of distrust occasionally. And to follow on with what Bridget said about women tend to work for the Barisan Nasional, I'm going to just sort of give that back to her.
Well, when we look at voting patterns, we definitely see that women tend to have more of a gender gap compared to men, that men traditionally are more inclined to be swing voters compared to women. Women tend to be a little bit less swing voters in terms of their practices, from what we can see of voting patterns. And this is true across Malaysia, particularly we can see this in Sabah. Just to pick up a few other points on the gender issue. there are very few women candidates in Sabah. And in fact, the percentage in Sabah is lower than that of the national, and the national is already quite low. And we're going to wait and see how this is slated, but parties will only slate a few women candidates. Warisan's list, for example, today was really did not have that many women inside, and I think it's very typical of the fact that that there is a problem in terms of parties choosing women candidates, and it also contributes to the nature of the way the politics is the messages and issues that are coming in political life, the types of issues that are given attention to. We also see a pattern in terms of gender in that we have, because the local candidates are seen to be about delivering things to local communities, this actually negatively impacts women. And the role that money plays in the election also negatively affects women as candidates in this process. So we have a whole series of factors, but many of the issues don't necessarily, in the campaigning, engage with women. Many of the parties do not have strong women branches, say, for example, like UMNO does in the peninsula. It doesn't have that same robustness that in Sabah, for example. So there's really a lot of gaps on multiple levels in terms of gender.
Okay, great. Fazila?
Yeah, thanks. Any of the three of you can answer my question. I was wondering whether or not the issues that were very, very strong during the 2018 election about Warisan being a foreigners party, and I think Shafi'i Abdal and his group very cleverly tried to discount that perception. He came up with his genealogy in every speech, that his grandfather was born here and the graves and all that. So this is a question of identity that's being questioned very strongly in Sabah. And somehow, with very clever political maneuvering, that got forgotten at the end by the win of Warisan Nasional led by Shafi'i Abdal. Do you see this issue being played out again in this election, or is not as important now because of what's happened in the last 2 years? And secondly, the question of religion. It is like in the peninsula, the more Islamic you are, the more votes you could get. Like in Australia, the more green you are, maybe the more votes you could get. In Islam, I know at the grassroots level, is receiving the influence of Tabligh group, all kinds of religious groups from Peninsula, and also from within Sabah, especially among coastal communities. Yeah. So is that an issue now being brought up by the people who feel threatened? For example, the Christian groups. Has that been brought up at all during this electioneering? Thanks.
Anyone?
Okay, I'll take the PTI question. I think it's the illegal immigrant or the identity issue. I think it's the top two issue. And then when you even look at Shafi defending himself, and then the attack from BNPN on illegal immigrant, and then you look at how PCS is talking about Sabah claim, etc., etc. The PTI issue or the illegal immigrant issue is big in Sabah, this Sabah election. Thanks.
Hi, Professor Fazila. I want to add on to what Philip just said. And of course, you know this very well. You've been working in the field for so many years. Is that I think it's very difficult to draw the line, or at least on a political narrative level, the difference between literal communities living in the East Coast and the migrants that occupy that same space, simply because there are overlaps by way of heritage and cultural identity. And I think that will continue to be a problem unless a sort of a larger discourse on loyalty and a sense of Sabah belonging is addressed, simply because it's always been that because there was the Sabah, there is the Philippines claim, and because there are people who are irregular migrants coming into and occupying the east coast of Sabah, then therefore the what do you call the residents that have been there for generations, who also consider themselves indigenous to the space, are essentially sort of pulled into this. But I think I want to sort of make very clear, in case this was overlooked or not made clear in the presentation, is that I'm not saying that the East Coasters and the West Coasters are fine. I mean, West Coasters are attacking. I'm not saying that East Coasters are passive in attack and that West Coasters are active in sort of the attack itself. I'm saying that the political landscape has allowed for that narrative to really thrive because it's necessary. It carries value at this moment. And I think as long as that sort of these porous waters with this influx of people continue to come in, and there are overlaps, which is very difficult to do, to fight off against, then there will continue to be that issue. I foresee that, like many other Sabah politicians, Shafi will have to sort of answer and continue to perform genealogy for people when necessary, because it is such a strong political narrative, right? The currency is of great value to fulfill this need to sort of like beef up this idea of real indigeneity, right? Originality of Sabahanness.
It has been brought out this election or not? This identity and place issues.
I think it does time and again, but not at the moment that I'm seeing. I will sort of, perhaps Philip and Bridget has seen differently. I think it will eventually come out again. There have been social media groups that have, of course, raised it using words like, pilak and things like that, which are all derogatory. But for me, I think to some extent it's been normalized. And so that's why, to a certain degree, it's also really difficult for us to say, is it more or less? It's been there, in my opinion, and it will continue to be there unless some major change comes into play. Thank you.
Add on a little bit in terms of the conversation to focus a little bit on the religious dimension. I think that you can't pull out any of these things completely from each other, right? Because they reinforce, this issue of foreigners and religion also sometimes can be integrated by certain communities and how they perceive things. I think there have been two things that I want to highlight. Number one is that the recent discussions about the Bible did have a lot of salience. And whether or not that continues or it's a one-off, whether it gains momentum, but I think it's not a coincidence that when Shafi Abdul was laying out the candidates today in his very long speech on Facebook beforehand, what he did is he actually, he made significant references to churches and to religious institutions, which I think shows that this is one element of the campaign and the part of the narrative that these politicians are projecting. And I think the same thing is from different sides. These issues are identity politics are being used in particular ways, and they resonate among different communities in very different type of ways. The second thing that I would say is that at the local level, because of the importance of local trusted social networks, churches, surau, religious schools that you can see across space in different parts of Sabah. If you're in Kalibakan or Kinabatangan and other places, you see religious schools. Right? You can see that the churches are very prominent. They're prominent social organizations, and they're prominent within those social networks. And they become important because of the fact that politics in Sabah is highly personalized in these local communities, and so they become important influencers. More so in some of these more remote areas, than you would appreciate from the outside, because this information, the network that is said by the pastor, for example, or by the imam, actually can have an influence quite importantly. And people speak to those things because they trust their local leaders and religious leaders. So I think that, at the different levels, the narrative and the campaign, as well as at the local level, these issues are important, but they tie into some of these other things as well.
Okay, we've got like a minute left, so I'm gonna just give you a question that I think has a short answer. How big a role is the COVID-19 situation going to play on voting day? Anyone? Hi. So we have a question, how big a role is COVID-19 situation going to play on voting day?
I think I'll speak to three things that I think are important. We don't know how many people will not be able to come back from the peninsula in particular and afford to come home. It's estimated 18% of the electorate live outside of the places that they live. And so this may affect voter turnout. Fortunately, many of the students are already back in Sabah, so this may not be as bad as that, but I think that the issue of turnout is one factor. The second issue, of course, is that there has been a cluster in Lahadato and Tawau, which, of course, raises attention to those issues and whether or not how it's managed through the campaign period. It may be localized, but it will bring COVID-19 questions to the fore a little bit more if the numbers and the cases start to move forward. I think Sabah has done an exemplary job, of managing COVID-19. I personally can say that I was extraordinarily impressed of how many people use masks in the middle of the forests and many of the interior areas, and a lot of that has been by local Sabahans sharing masks and distributing masks. So I think that, but if there is this particular cluster that expands, this will become an issue that the governments of different levels will have to address. And I think the third issue that I think is important is that COVID-19 brings attention to the problems of healthcare access, which are very serious in Sabah. And I think that it reinforces for many people the problems of the fact that there's infrastructure, inadequate services that many Sabahans don't have. And these are issues that I think really drive home. And it's coupled with the economic downturn that is actually affecting Sabahans harder because there has higher levels of vulnerability, as I've discussed earlier in my presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bridget. Anybody else to answer that? Phila or Philip? So
No, I'm okay. Thanks.
okay.
Yeah, I think Bridget filled in the gap. I do echo her sentiment that COVID-19 is perceived a little bit differently in Sabah, especially those in the interiors, because for many, getting access to really decent healthcare, I wouldn't say good, can be very difficult. So, I think how it plays a role is that if the numbers grow, and of course there is a conspiracy theory to the correlation of the emergence of new clusters in Sabah and what's going on politically as well, but that's a conversation for another time, is that I think people will also have to really think very carefully about whether they can afford to get sick, because that impacts everything else in life, especially when you have so little.
Okay, we've run out of time, but there's so many other questions, and maybe I see there's another new message. So if other people have questions, and maybe the speakers could just type the responses in the meeting chat. But I would like to thank everybody for coming, and our speakers as well as our attendants. And we will post this up on YouTube. So thank you. Now for the speakers, I'm just gonna take a photo. Oh wait, is it possible? Yeah, I think it's possible. I hope. So let's try to do that. If you could all just have your cameras on, and even maybe the attendants too, if you're happy to participate, or try and take a picture. So everybody, yay. And I'm just gonna use my phone to take the picture. Yeah, more people.
Oh, Philip is doing a warisan.
What can you do?
Get yourself into trouble, Philip.
Oh, K-pop too, Philip.
Hi. Anybody else? Hurry up. We're going to take the photo and then we have to go. No? That's it? Okay. Smile. Okay. One more quick one. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for sitting through. Thanks, Gay. Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Philip.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks, Kek.
Bye.
Bye.